Okay, let's
Hang on one second.
let's get started. I have to have this close because I really want the audio on this, and even having it back there, and I think taking the case off makes it sound better as well. So let's pray, and then let's get started. Dear Father in heaven, Lord, we thank you for the ability to gather together around the fellowship of your word. And as we start a new series tonight, Lord, I pray, God, that our hearts and our minds would be blessed, and a series that's near and dear to my heart, Lord, the study of your life and your teaching through your son Jesus. And it's by him and by his grace that we lift this up to you, and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
So let's start. Let me start on a personal note. This is a series that I wanted to do a long time ago, and the reason is I consider myself, out of anything, kind of a Jesus guy. Like, we all have our canon within the canon, right? That's not necessarily wrong to do. Like, you have your favorite books of the Bible, you have your favorite things of that. My favorites by far have always been the Gospels. Those have been my favorite, two in particular. Matthew and John have been my two favorite Gospels by far. And I used to be kind of a hyper red letter type of a person, you know, where I believed that the red letters were something special back when I was about 18 years old. I remember that I had this King James version of the Bible, and this King James version of the Bible had the letters in red. It was actually issued by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and I got it from my mom, and I would just read the red letters. Like, that's it. You know, thinking that there was something special about the red letters, extra special than the rest of the Bible. You know, of course, in one sense, they all need to be red letters because they're all the Word of God. But it was a time in my life where I was kind of floundering in my Christian faith. And I thought, you know what, I need to read the Bible again. And I didn't know where to start or whatever. So I just picked this King James version up and started reading it, those red letters. And that really spoke to me. And quite honestly, the life of Christ has always really spoke to me, because I think if there was any time in ministry that I would like to be, it would be at that time. If I could transport myself back in time to any point in time, it would be during the life of Christ. And I read the Bible almost that way, particularly the Gospels. I try to imagine myself in the story. You know, like I'm reading about Jesus feeding the 5,000. Like, what if I was actually there? You know, if I was actually there and saw him. You know.
Mine would be at the tomb.
The whole thing for me. But honestly, if there's any point in time that I would like to go back, it would be in the life and the ministry of Jesus Christ, those 3.5 years. Let's open our Bible to, I want to go to two places, Luke chapter 2, the first couple of verses, and Luke chapter 3, the first couple of verses. And there's a method to my madness on this, and some challenges. You got to excuse me, I've been fighting off a cold the last few days.
Try that St. George nano silver.
I do have some of that. I forget about that. It's in my cupboard.
Get you some Zycam.
Zycam. All right. Everybody's a doctor. Everybody's a doctor. Get lots of rest and drink lots of fluid, right? That's what that's what I do. Well, I tell you what, I take a lot of vitamin C, and out of everybody in my house, I'm way better than everybody else. So, in those days, chapter 2 and verse 1. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. All right. And chapter 3 in verse 1. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip tetrarch of the region of Iturea and that other place I can't pronounce, and that other place I can't pronounce, and the tetrarch of that other place I can't pronounce, during the high priest of Ananias and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, the son of Zechariah. Okay, so why do I bring this up? Well, I bring it up because when we study the life of Christ, I want us to understand that we are studying a point in history, that we are actually studying a historical figure who actually lived and walked the earth, and he lived at a particular time, and he lived at a particular time and in a particular government and in a particular context. And given that we are 2,000 years removed and a language removed away from that, there obviously are some questions. So you could imagine, or some backdrop that helps us understand the story better. So for example, let's say you were living 1,000 or 2,000 years from now when you spoke a different language and you were really into American history. Okay, you were really into American history, but there you had a problem. Like you had a lot about, like, let's say you had a lot about the Pilgrims coming over. Like you had a lot about that. And, they come over, there's this religious persecution, there's, the kings, and they're upset because they're not part of the Church of England or whatever, and then they escape to here to escape that persecution and to establish new colonies and things like that. And then you read all about that, and then the next thing you know, there's nothing. You have nothing. Well, I shouldn't say you have nothing, but next to nothing, at least nothing popular until Ronald Reagan. And then you're reading about Ronald Reagan and about, him coming to power and how he used to be an actor and all this stuff. Or maybe you don't even have that. Let's say, all you have is, his presidency and him appointing people and him running against Carter and, his administration. And you have this little blip on the screen, and then you have nothing again. You have nothing again until Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Right? What would you want to know? You would be a little bit lost. Now, you wouldn't be completely lost. Don't misunderstand me, because the text itself is enough to give you everything you need. It's called the perspicuity of Scripture. In other words, you can open the Bible and read it, and you understand it fairly well. But there are some things that kind of, if we understand the backdrop, it helps us understand the situation. So, for example, you would want to know about the government, I think. So you're reading something like President Trump did this or President Person did this, but you see the documents you had before said the King of England. You'd be like, well, you would know by the context that a president is a type of leader. But you'd be like, well, how's that different than a king? How's that different than this? Why is there a president now? What happened? How come they're in a presidency and they're not calling Ronald Reagan their elected king? Why are they calling Ronald Reagan the elected president? I don't quite understand from the first point to the last point. And the differences between a president and a governor and a mayor. You'd want to know the differences between those two things. You'd be like, well, okay, I get a governor, that's a common thing kind of everywhere. But how's that different than a president? You'd want to know what the political situation is of the day, particularly if those political terms are used. You'd be like, what do all those things mean? Why is it so different from the 400 years previously? Also, the second thing you probably want to know is, this is the first, the second thing you don't know is you want to know about groups of people. So, for example, let's say you're reading about President Trump and he's down in Las Vegas and, or during his election, and the Black National Caucus is outside and they're decrying him as a racist. And then the NRA is there, and they're saying, we need to elect Trump, he's our guy. Well, you might want to know, well, what's the NRA? Now, you would get an idea if the NRA said something like, you're reading this 2,000 years and you're separated you would get the idea that the NRA is a pro-gun movement. You'd understand that, but you might not understand who Charlton Heston is from the NRA, or the Black National Caucus. And then you might even have other religious groups, you know. You had somebody like from the Right to Life movement. You'd be like, well, what's the Right to Life movement, you know? Political groups and offices and you know, you might have like the Presbyterians might be there, and the Baptists, you know, these would all be groups that they would talk about, and we tend to think of these things as something that's always been around or always will be around. That's not necessarily the case. There's been lots of denominations that are dead. They're dead and gone. They're dead and gone. So like, for instance, the Jansenists. Is anybody a Jansenist here? You know, or even heard of a Jansenist? They were a pretty popular group. They were a pretty popular group. The Waldorvians. What's that? The Joneses.
The Jim Joneses.
Temple Lot. Those are some. Yeah, they're gone. Yeah, the Temple Lot's gone. You can imagine 2,000 years from now, somebody talking about Temple Lot. You'd be like, oh, you know. We tend to think that denominations kind of stick around forever. They don't. We're not sure which ones will stick around. There'll always be some representation of Christianity. You would want to know about that. You'd also want to know about places. You'd be like, good night. What's everybody so worried about Iowa for? Where is Iowa anyway? What are they doing in Iowa? What's everybody so concerned about whether or not who wins the Iowa straw caucus or whatever it is? You'd kind of wonder. You'd wonder that. I think the fourth thing that you'd want to worry about also is the language. The language is being used. Like last I looked, everybody was Indian, Spanish. When we look back the last time, Indian, Spanish, and you know, the colonies that came over from England. Well, you know, it seems like a lot of people speak Spanish, a lot of people speak English. You'd want to know about the idioms of that language. What kind of language? Why aren't they all speaking Navajo? I mean, what happened? How come the Navajos aren't even speaking Navajo? They don't even know their own language now, right? These would be things that you would want to understand. And I think the fifth thing that you would understand is, what are the resources? What are the resources? So for example, let's say we are 2,000 years in the future, and we're separated by a different language. And I was like, I got this best book on American history that I just found. I found, huh?
Like Clausen?
No, I'm pretending we're in the future, 2,000 years, and we're separated by that. I said, oh man, I got this. You got to go. Well, 5 minutes, you got to go.
I thought that was 20. That's a 15 mark.
You'd probably want to know, like, if I said I got this really good book. It's National Treasure. It's a show. It's got Nicolas Cage in it. You know, it's like I heard he's or you know, whatever the guy's name, not Nicolas Cage, but the character in the movie National Treasure. You'd be like, well, that crosses over into history a bit, but there's a lot of fiction along with it. You know, you'd want to know about about these things. So I think these are some of the challenges that we're going to address this week and next week, and then we'll enter into the life of Christ proper. So as far as like the government, is this like, well, we in the Old Testament, and Persia is in power and Israel's back in the land for the most part. There are some Jews who are still in Babylon, and then you switch over 400 years. And there's no king there. Well, there's the Roman ruler, right? That's who's. And you have King Herod, and you have Pontius Pilate. He's a procurator. I'm not going to say that right.
Procurator.
That's the procurator. Like, what's this guy procuring? What's going on here? How come we have this? You would wonder about officials. You know, you'd wonder, well, you know, why is Felix an official? You know, that kind of thing. You'd wonder, what is the political situation like? It comes up. Who's in charge? How come they have more than one high priest? How come Jesus is dragged to two high priests? When I read the Old Testament says that the high priest reigns until he's dead. How come they have two trials, one in front of one high priest and one in front of the other high priest, and then they drag Jesus to Pontius Pilate, and then they drag Jesus to Herod, the Herod that lives up north, and then they drag him back to Pontius. Why in the world is he going through so many trials?
They're not explaining that in the Bible, right?
No, I mean, you can kind of catch on to what's going on, and I think everybody's been in church long enough that you kind of get an idea of this because you hear sermons and people digress and make those things. But yeah, I mean, just the Bible itself doesn't go, oh yeah, and Pontius Pilate was this, and this is where he came from, and this is what we know about him. Sometimes it does that, sometimes it doesn't. Well, what would we know about the groups of people? Probably we want to know like who the Pharisees are, who the Sadducees are, who the Herodians, and then what's that other group that was, it's going to come to me in just a second here.
Zealots.
Yes, there we go, thank you. Who are these people? And how do they differ from one another? I mean, how does a Sadducee differ from a Pharisee?
You're a Sadducee.
How does a Pharisee differ from a scribe? What's the difference between a Pentecostal and a Baptist, right? I mean, could you imagine that being in the future? And you'd be like, okay, a Pentecostal and a Baptist. Okay, so a Baptist believes in baptism by immersion. We'll see you later.
Don't forget the
Right,
cake.
I won't.
A baptism believes in baptism by immersion. Okay, so Pentecostals, then they don't believe in baptism by immersion? Oh, they do believe in baptism. Okay, so then how are they different now? Okay, so Pentecostals believe you speak in tongues. Baptists, well, some Baptists do, some Baptists don't. Well, which is it? You'd be like, which is it? Why are these people called Baptists and these people called Pentecostals? You'd kind of want to know that kind of thing. So the groups, that's what you'd want to know. You'd want to know what kind of political groups there are. Places like Galilee, Judea, the Judean wilderness, and Samaria. Why do they freak out about going across Samaria? What's the deal there? They go across Samaria. It seems like this big deal. Jesus goes into Samaria the first time, everybody welcomes him. He goes into Samaria the second time, people come up and go, not so fast. Not so fast. Could you not come through Samaria? Last time you made a big ruckus. So, you get an idea. The languages. Well, we know that Rome is in power. How come not everybody's speaking Latin? I mean, why is that? Why isn't the Bible written in Latin if everybody at that time was speaking, if Rome was the superpower of the day? Why is it in Greek rather than in Latin? So, and then the books as well. What are the source material? We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Why not Thomas? Why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? I mean, why not, just Matthew and John? Why not Matthew, Luke, and John? I mean, who needs Mark, right? I mean, everything in Mark is a small gospel. Why are these for the gospels? And how do we know who wrote them in the first place? We're going to be answering those questions. I'm laughing at myself in my head about how I sound right now. I sound really different. To me, anyway. I'm going to see how it sounds on the.
Sound like Alex Jones.
A little raspy.
Sound like Alex Jones. Oh, he sounds like this. It's lizard people. All right, so let's. No, I don't know. He didn't believe that, does he? No, I was kidding about that. That's the only thing that came to my mind. Okay, so. You've seen what on YouTube? The lizard people. Let's attempt.
Gotta be real, it's on the internet.
To answer these questions tonight and next week. And by the way, we will be going through some gospel criticisms as well, because part of what we need to know is why we believe that Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, and John wrote John, and why we believe that those four are inspired and others are not. So we'll be going through that kind of stuff too. But tonight I want to get the historical background of what happened between the Old Testament and the New Testament, why things are the way they are. And that's going to be a little bit difficult. Of course, I'm going to be skipping through some time and things like that. But we're going to hit the highlights. We're going to hit the highlights. We're going to kind of boil it down to what I think is the most important aspects that I think we need to understand. So, when the Old Testament closes, what's the superpower? No. When the Old
Greece,
Testament
Greece.
closes. No.
No.
Persia.
Persia, that's right.
Persia is the superpower. Greece happens in Persia after the Persian invasion. It's hard to do this not on a map, but you can picture like Rome over here. Okay, so, all right, and then Egypt down here, I'm really messing this up. And then a bunch of stuff over here. Saudi Arabia, I'm not doing this well at all. Okay, so Greece is around this area right here.
Erase that by your hand, please.
What's that?
Erase that by your hand. Thank you.
Oh, boy, people have got an imagination. So here's Africa.
You drew it, dude.
That's like that Rorschach test. Did you see that?
Rorschach.
Rorschach
Yeah.
test.
Yes.
There's a joke, a little bit off color, but the joke is the guy shows him a picture of a Rorschach,
Rorschach.
yeah, ink blot, and he says, "What do you see here?" He says, "Well, I see naked people." And then he goes, "Okay." He goes, "What do you see here?" And he says, "Well, I see naked people." And he says, "Okay, what do you see here?" He says, "I see naked people." He says, "Well, you got sex on your mind." He goes, "Well, you're the one showing me the dirty pictures." So, I think we all see what we want to see. You know what? I'm not going to try this. This is so bad. This is so bad.
It's like anatomy gone wrong.
Let me get this globe here so we can kind of see this. I know this won't be on the video, but this will be, at least we'll be able to hear it. And
flat.
yeah, the earth is flat. So in the USA, right here where Jesus was born, on the flat earth. Just kidding.
In Arizona.
Holy smokes.
Tucson.
They really made this. Okay. So, it's so small. All right, here's Egypt right here. Can you see that? You can't see this. What am I doing?
Turn it side. There we go. There, now we can see it.
Can you see it? All right. Caspian Sea, India, Iran, Iraq. Where was that? Where was Egypt? Italy. There's Italy. Okay.
I like Italy.
So almost everything from Italy all the way over into Saudi Arabia is what Alexander the Great conquered. He conquered that. He just
Busy guy.
whipped butt. But it was all owned before by down into Egypt here and all the way up in here. And it kind of, if you look on it, it kind of looks like a woman on her knees with a bag is kind of what it looks like with the crown on her head. It was owned previously by Persia, as we said, and before that it was owned by Babylon. Before that it was owned by Syria. Syria kind of conquered the known world, then the Persians took over, and then Alexander the Great took over. Well, Alexander the Great died in 323 BC. And he had no heir. And on his deathbed, they were asking him, who should rule your kingdom? And he said, the strongest was his last thing he said.
What did he say again?
He said the strongest should rule. And his empire, over about a 15-year period, split into 5 kingdoms. And it ended up being 4 kingdoms. And we're just going to pretend here. So it ended up being like in Macedon, and then a little further over in Thrace, and then over here in Arabia, and then down in Egypt. And there was another kingdom over here as well. Okay. Now the one in Egypt is the one we got to look for. Okay, that's going to be a major player. Okay, that's called the Ptolemaic kingdom. Because it was ruled by Ptolemy. That's one of his generals, Ptolemy. They had different ones. They had Cassandra was over here, and Antigus, the one-eyed, was here, and you had, anyway, different ones here. But one of these kingdoms tried to come down and attack Ptolemy, who was ruling in Egypt. This is where Cleopatra comes from. This is years before Cleopatra, but a lot of times people think Cleopatra was Egyptian. She wasn't. She was Ptolemaic. She was Greek. She was the last of the Ptolemaic Empire there. There were 6 of them. And there were 13 Ptolemies, by the way. So it goes nuts. So I'm going to try to. He said, we're not having any of this. And so he sends his general out up here, whose name's Seleucid.
Who was it that attacked him?
It was Perdiccas. Perdiccas who attacked him. But he sends Seleucid out. Selecus. Cus. And Seleucus takes this area up here and conquers this kingdom. And then Cassandra, Seleucus, and Ptolemy all attack Antigus the One-Eye. And his kingdom finally divides into 4. And Seleucus says, I ain't coming back, I'm staying up here in the north. I'm staying here. So we lose a kingdom. But the only 2 that we have to really worry about is Seleucus and Ptolemy. Okay, those are the 2 major kingdoms. And the reason why they're the 2 major kingdoms is because Ptolemy is down here in Egypt. We're just going to say that's Egypt. And then you have a little land bridge, and that's Israel. And up here is the Seleucid kingdom. You get your minds out of the gutter.
You're the one that started laughing.
All right.
We're just over here taking notes.
All right. So Israel becomes this ping pong ball as to who is going to be the one who's in charge of them. Is it going to be the Seleucid Empire, or is it going to be the Ptolemaic Empire? And they bounce back and forth, the Ptolemaics and the Seleucids. And the Ptolemies and the Seleucids don't get along, obviously. By the way, Ptolemy II, he's down here in Egypt, and he wants to build a library.
Draw a straight line.
Yes, okay. He wants to build a library. And he wants every book in the world to be in that library. And one of the books that he wants in the library is the Old Testament. And so he says, hey, we need the Old Testament. He goes, but I'm not going to have it in Hebrew, because they don't speak anything but Greek. They're very stuck up when it comes to that. They're very evangelistic when it comes to their lifestyle. They wanted everybody to speak Greek. That was one of the things Alexander did, is he wanted everybody to speak Greek. Is he says, we'll translate it into the Old Testament into Greek, and so that's where we get the Septuagint from, because there was 70 or 72 scholars. So whenever you see LXX, that means the Septuagint, because it was translated by 70 scholars. Now there's a legend to that that says that 70 different scholars all translated the Old Testament into Greek, and that they all came out the same. So it was, a miracle of God. It was the King James Bible. But no, I'm kidding. But that's probably not what happened. Probably what happened was just 70 scholars worked on it and came up with different translations. By the way, the New Testament quotes and favors the Septuagint over against the Hebrew text in many places. So that's why sometimes when you're reading the New Testament and you see a quote out of it from the Old Testament, then you go back to the Old Testament and you read it, it's a little different. You're like, well, what's going on here? Well, they're actually quoting out of the Septuagint. And one of the things you have to know for biblical criticism is that every translation of the Old Testament that we have comes from like 900 to 1200 AD. All of your Bibles are based on those Hebrew texts later, much later editions. And so the LXX was obviously a translation of an earlier manuscript, of earlier manuscripts. So I favor it where they favor it as well. And we'll see some of that as we go along, I'm sure. So these two, they fight with each other. The Seleucids in the north and the Ptolemies in the south. Now, go on a few generations, and the next thing we need to know is that one of these Seleucids is called Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Antiochus IV. Now he's the next major player in this, and this is going to start off what's called the Maccabean Revolt. Okay, you all heard about the Maccabean Revolt. So this is a few generations afterwards now, a couple hundred years, maybe 100 and some odd years later. We're about at this point at about 170 BC. So, around there, around 170 BC. So we're a few years out from this. Now, his father was Antiochus III, and he was called Antiochus III the Great. And Antiochus III the Great, he said he wanted to be the next Alexander the Great. And so he tried to conquer the world again, but he failed. He did a pretty good job, but he couldn't wrestle away the other Greek empires. And he really failed when it came to the Ptolemaic and the Egyptian kingdom. He was really upset about that. And actually, Antiochus was captured at one point by Rome when he was a little kid, when he was younger. And he grew up kind of in Rome. And he escaped, and he comes back over here. He comes back, and he says, I'm going to finish what my father started. And he had huge problems with the Jews because, as you know, the Jews are nice and friendly, but they're not going to change. They're not going to stop eating kosher. They're not going to, they're going to continue with all their stuff. They're not going to let you worship their gods there. There's no pluralism for the Jewish people at this time. So Antiochus never really gets along with the Jews because he really wants the whole world to be Greek. He wants to finish what Alexander started and before his empire was started. So he masses a huge campaign, beats a bunch of people, comes down, wins over Jerusalem, back from the Ptolemies, and then he comes down into Egypt, and he's very successful until the last city. And then the last city, the last of the Ptolemies were there, the Ptolemy of the 13th. And he comes up to the city where he's going to take over. He's done this great job. And one Roman general comes out. Just one Roman general comes out. And he says, the Ptolemies want you out of Egypt. So the Ptolemies have made deals with Rome by this time because they don't like what's going on up here. So he says, we want you out. And Antiochus says, I'll think about it. And the Roman official drew a circle. He said, you can think about it all you want. And he drew a circle around him he was in front of the army, and he only had one guy out there. He drew a circle around him. And he said, you make up your mind before you leave that circle what you're going to do. And he grew up in Rome, and he knew the power of Rome. And so he went back with his tail between his legs. And as he goes back, there's a rumor in Israel that he died. Now, it's just a rumor, just like we have fake news today. They had fake news back then. Yeah. And they were all excited. They were all happy. Hey, this guy's dead. You know, he was trying to enforce all these rules and all this stuff. So he comes back to town, and to their, chagrin, he's alive. And they're not happy to see him. And he says, okay. So he's dejected. He's like, he's got to kick something. If he can't kick them, he's going to kick his dog, right? So he comes back and he says, that's it. I've had it with you guys. And he institutes, not Roman law, Greek law. And that's when he outlaws the scriptures. He outlaws circumcision. He does a sacrifice in the temple of a pig. He does all these things that upset the people or whatever. But he basically does this with his army. He kills a bunch of people. I mean, he says this is the way it's going to be. He erects a temple of Zeus in the Holy of Holies. Nobody knows what Zeus looks like. He just happens to look like Antiochus IV. So he erects a statue of himself there. So this is the next major thing that we have to understand, is because of this is what kicks off the Maccabean revolt. Okay? So the Maccabees at this time, Israel at this time, was under the control of the Seleucids of Antiochus. They were under the Greek control. And they've been under Greek control now for a couple hundred years. So they finally said, we've had it. And they launched a very, and some people debate whether or not this was the first time that guerrilla warfare was carried out. Because they can't defeat Roman or Greeks on battle with lances, right? You're going to go up against them with a few people. But what they did was they attacked them in their sleep, that kind of thing. They really waged war, and they won. They won their independence in 160 BC. They were a free state. They weren't under control of the Ptolemies, and they weren't under control of the Seleucids. They were a free state. But be careful what you wish for, because no sooner did they issue freedom that they started infighting. And they started infighting about who was going to be the high priest, because the people who were kings also said, okay, we threw these people off. We're the guys in charge. We're also going to be the high priests. And as you know, the king and the high priest aren't supposed to be the same lineage. The king is Judah, and the high priest is the tribe of Levites. So this is where you have the Pharisees coming from. The Pharisees finally come out of this because the Pharisees called themselves the pure ones. Another group that comes out of this that's not mentioned in the New Testament, but is very much the topic of a lot of things, a lot of discussion today, is the Qumran community, where we get the Dead Sea Scrolls from. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the people of the Qumran community said, they thought the Pharisees were too big of compromisers. So you guys are too big of compromisers. Wow. What we're going to do is we're going to go out in about 100 BC. They go out into the wilderness, and they're a bizarre group. You don't hear about them in the New Testament at all, but they're a bizarre group. They have pretend temple worship. They literally had they would pretend that they were in a temple and go out and slaughter the calf and all that stuff once a year, all in their imagination. And it's even rumored, this is funny, that on Saturday, they didn't even poop. And we know that, we deduce that because when you look at their writings, they say that a Sabbath, that in order to go to the bathroom, you had to walk a certain distance, right? You had to go out of the camp and walk a certain distance. 100 feet, let's just say it's 100 feet, just round numbers. Well, On Saturday, it says you can't walk more than 50 feet. It's a Sabbath, according to them, you can't. So it's the conclusion is that they held it until until Sunday. Now we don't know that for sure, and those aren't the exact numbers, by the way. I'm just using that as an example. But these guys, they finally win their independence, but then they start infighting. Okay. Next historical figure. We're getting closer. And now we're going to get into some relevant material as well, okay? John, but now you know why everybody's speaking Greek, for one. It's because Greek was the common language. And we will speed up Hyrcanus the First. John Hyrcanus the First kind of rises to power. There's a few assassinations and things like that. I mean, it's really brutal. But he rises to power. And Israel's kind of really small at this time. It's really small. And his contribution to this is that he starts to expand the borders of Israel. And one of the places he expands the borders of Israel is that he conquers them is Idumea. And who knows who's from Idumea? Who knows? Who's the Bible person that we run into who's from Idumea, who plays a big part, and his sons play a big part? No.
Oh, wait a minute. It's Hophni and Phinehas.
Nope. Well, I don't know. Herod. Herod is an Idumean, which is from Esau's line, basically.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, I was thinking Esau.
Esau. That's
Edomites.
Yeah, Edomites. That's the Idumean is kind of the Latin translation of that. So he's from Idumea. Now Edomites, they're not Jews, but John Hyrcanus says you're going to be Jews or you're going to die. So they all convert to Judaism, which isn't normally what Jews do. Jews don't normally evangelize by the sword, but John Hyrcanus the First did. Okay, and so you had a whole group of Idumeans who were Jews not by birth, but were Jews by forced conversion, and this is where Herod the Great comes in. He comes in a little bit later, but that's his background. He's not Jewish. He's Idumean, and he gets to rule the Jews. And it comes into power because of, we're going to go to a grandson actually. John Hyrcanus II. He's not junior, he's second. He's a grandson of John Hyrcanus. Now, John Hyrcanus fights for being a king. He's king for a while. He kind of gets kicked out by his brother. And now we're getting closer. We're getting down to about, 65 to 63 AD. And he has a really good friend. BC. I'm sorry. BC. All right. He has a really, really super good friend. His friend is Antipater. And Antipater is the father of Herod. Okay? So, what happens? Why is Herod in charge when we get to the New Testament? What happens here? Now we got this whole story here. So what actually happens? Well, John Hyrcanus, he's vying for rulership of Israel. He gets kicked out by his brother, and he's outside of Jerusalem, and just who happens to be in the neighborhood? Pompey, the Roman general, the one who's the friend of Julius Caesar. Okay, so Julius Caesar's in power at this time, and Pompey is doing a campaign. He's commissioned to go settle some stuff. And he comes down and he sees that John Hyrcanus is kind of outside Rome, and he says, "What's going on?" And John Hyrcanus says, "Well, you know what? We'll pay taxes to Rome if you help me get in power." And he says, "Okay." So they conquer Rome together. It actually wasn't even a fight at all. People just said, because they weren't happy with his brother either. They said, okay, we'll take this guy, whatever. But Antipater, he really is kind of a puppet king to Antipater. Antipater is really the military force that he has at his disposal. And his son Herod is also a military guy as well. And so what Antipater does is he says, all righty, now that I'm in charge, John Hyrcanus was in charge, he goes, but really, I'm in charge. He goes, I'm going to put my sons in charge. One up to the north, which was Herod. He's up in Galilee. And then his other son, Faisal. Let's see. Faisal. Phasal. He's in the south. Okay, John Hyrcanus eventually dies. Antipater is the guy who's really in charge. And Israel doesn't like this either. It's a lot of history, right? It's a lot of history. But you got to know this, right? It helps. I mean, it's like, why is Herod in charge? What's the deal? What the heck happened? So Herod's in charge to the north. Faisal's in charge to the south. Well, wouldn't you know it? Another civil war breaks out in Israel. And they said, look, we don't like the Romans either. So what we're going to do is we're going to enlist the Parthians. And the Parthians come down and they kick Herod, they kill Faisal, he dies. But Herod then becomes the lone stander and he gets kicked all the way back to Rome. And he goes back to Rome, and in Rome, he's got Mark Antony there, Mark Antony Cleopatra fame, and then Octavius, Julius Caesar's, I think, dead by this time. So Octavius and Mark Antony, and Mark Antony, he bribes Mark Antony, and Mark Antony says, that sounds great. We're going to send you with the forces of Rome back to Israel. And as we send you with the forces of Rome back to Israel, he goes, we're going to go ahead and make you king of Israel. And so that's how Herod becomes king of Israel, as he comes back and he kind of kills everybody who disagreed with him, and he gets himself in trouble with the Pharisees because he kills people who rebelled against him, but he kills them without a trial. So he just comes back and he kills everybody. But he becomes the superpower of Israel at the time. All right, so now in our metaphor, we are up to Ronald Reagan, right? We got a few more, like how do we get from Ronald Reagan to Trump? Because by the time Jesus is born, Herod's there, and we see that, right? But by the time Jesus comes on the scene with his ministry, Herod's dead. We've got Pontius Pilate ruling in the south. How come it's not another Herod? And we've got one of his sons ruling the north on one side and one of his sons ruling the south on the other side. And that's kind of the political Herod Philip and then Herod Antipas. That's what I'm looking for, Herod Antipas. Well, Herod's son Archelaus originally was in Judea. He was originally reigning in Judea. And so if you look at Israel like this, you had Herod Antipas up here, Herod Philip up here, and Archelaus down here. So Antipas, Philip, Archelaus, Herod the Great's dead. Archelaus does such a bad job because he kills people. And people don't like that when you just kill people. And that they have to get rid of him. And so they put in a standby, a procurator. That just means he procures taxes. And they run through about 6 of these, by the way. And finally you get to Pontius Pilate. And that's what the scene of the day looks like by the time. What's so funny? It doesn't look like anything but Israel to me.
Oh my God, I'm sitting with it with the little boy.
You know, this is going to go up on YouTube, just so you know. All right. Let's talk for a minute about Herod, because you need to know about him.
Sorry.
It's all right.
He's quoting movie lines at me.
I see. Where do these sons come from? Because you got Herod Antipas. He marries Herodias, who's the brother of Philip, but not the other Philip you're thinking of, not the Philip who's ruling up north. Where's that Philip? Where does all this come from? Why is Herodias called Herodias? Well, it's actually a niece. It's kind of a weird family thing. And then they have a daughter named Salome, she had a daughter named Salome, and Salome ends up marrying another Herod, and you meet all these Herods in the New Testament, right? You got Herod Philip, you got Herod the Great, you've got Herod Agrippa, you've got Herod, and so like, what's going on? What happened? Okay, so we got Herod the Great first of all. So Herod has 10 wives, by the way. We're only going to concern ourselves with the first few, okay? Because they're the only ones who come into play.
He did too, right?
His first wife was Doris, and Doris had a son. But Herod, in an attempt to gain political favor with the people, married Mariamne. Okay, so he married Mariamne. The first. There's two girls named Mariamne, and Mariamne has two sons. I'm just gonna A and B, son A and B. Now Mariamne has a brother whom Herod puts in charge of the temple, but people start liking him a little bit more than they like Herod. So Herod goes back to Rome and says, let's get rid of this guy. However, Mariamne's mother goes to Rome and says, look, there's too many changes happening in Israel, let's just keep everything the same. And so Herod says, all right, we'll just keep everything the same. And he goes back home and he says, hey, let's have a party at my swimming pool. And everybody's invited. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, guess who drowns? Her brother drowns. Now, no one's able to pin this on him at this point, but it's pretty obvious. He's the only one who drowns. And they just got back from Rome. You know, it's like the Clintons kind of a thing going on here. Okay, so Mariamne, now it's said that Herod really loved Mariamne. He really had a thing for her. And Mariamne and her mother then started to conspire against Herod, as the story goes. Those things aren't sure. But he has both Mariamne's mother and Mariamne put to death, which he grieved over that for the rest of her life. There's even a story that he preserved her in honey and kept her body where he could see it. Her official thing was that she was unfaithful. That was the official mark. But she denied it to the day she died, and Herod never got over killing her. Now at this point you start getting into Herod, the hungry for power, consolidating his power, really starting to be demented about this. So these two people, their uncle's dead, their mom's dead, their grandmother's dead, and they're Herod's sons. So they're being suspiciously acting suspicious, and Herod thinks that they're gonna look for his throne too. So he goes back to Rome, and under Octavius, he can't just kill him. Yeah, he can't just kill him, but under Octavius, he says, I want to kill these guys. I want to kill them. And Octavius says, go ahead. Octavius, also known as Caesar Augustus, says, go ahead, kill him. And then when he left, That's when he said, it's better to be Herod's pig than Herod's son. Have you heard that saying before? It rhymes in Greek. It's, well, not rhymes, but it sounds, it says it's better to be Herod's hoss than wehos. And it's like slam kind of in a double way, you know. I mean, Herod's supposed to be Jewish, at least by conversion. Jews aren't supposed to eat pigs, but you know he's not a good Jew. So you know if you're his pig, that every once in a while he might sneak a little bacon over here on the side, and so you might not be too safe being Herod's pig, but you're really not safe being his son. Herod marries another girl, Matthias. And through her, he has Herod Antipas. Now he's the guy who tries Jesus. He's the guy who, when Pontius Pilate hears that Herod Antipas is in town, he says, "Oh, Jesus is from Galilee. Go send him up there." Herod Antipas is also the one who marries his brother Philip's wife, Herodias.
John the Baptist.
And John the Baptist, and he has John the Baptist headed. That's Herod Antipas. Also through him is Herod Archelaus. We already talked about him. He's the guy who was originally in Judea, but he does such a bad job that he gets killed. So let's see here. Through, I can't remember which son it was exactly. His first wife Doris has a son. His name's Antipater, named after Herod's father. Antipater gets killed too. These two people get killed off as well. So Alexander and Aristobulus are these two sons. And anyway, it gets confusing. I've got a paper here if anybody wants to see it. We're getting a little long in the tooth. He marries, let's see, I'm trying to catch up here. Mariamne II. Oh, what I wanted to say is that Herodias is and Herod Antipas's half-sister. She comes from one of these two. So she's his half-sister. But,
Keep it in the family.
right. Through, yeah. But she was married already. Herodias was married to another guy named Herod Philip. Not the same Philip that rules in the north later. So you have Herodias, and then you have Herod Philip, and he steals Herodias from Herod Philip, right? Herod Philip doesn't want anything to do with politics. Does this make sense? No? Am I getting
Oh, it does.
confused?
There's just a lot going on.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. Herod Antipas steals the wife from Herod Philip, Herodias, who's his half-sister, and she's already married to another half-brother. So
Our gene pool's getting smaller and smaller.
our gene pool's
and
getting smaller and smaller, right. King Agrippa, our grandchildren from over here, and so is Felix, a great-grandchildren. King Agrippa and King Agrippa II, which turn up in Acts, their grandchildren. And then he marries another girl named Cleopatra, not related to the Cleopatras, and that's where the other Philip comes from that rules in Galilee, that rules up in the north on this side of Galilee. So that's a little hard. Anyway, you can print this off for yourself. There it is.
That's a lot going on.
There's another one. He's got 10 wives altogether, and it's said that he changed his will like 13 times throughout the course of his life.
I'm mad at you. I'm writing you out.
Basically. So that's the political day in which he was born. This is why when Jesus comes on the scene, Rome is ruling and Herod is the king in the south, and are the whole king, and then you have Pontius Pilate in his ministry, and the two Herods up in the north. That's what's going on politically. Let me make one more quick comment about language. This will not take too long. The next week we will get into gospel criticism. But why isn't everybody speaking Latin if Rome is ruling? Well, Rome didn't care what language you spoke. They didn't care. Greeks did. Greeks wanted everybody to speak Greek. That's what they wanted. And you might think that Jesus and the apostles and every Jew at that time spoke Hebrew. They didn't. Most people didn't even know Hebrew. It was either used ceremonially, or it was mostly a lost language. Now, did Jesus know Hebrew? He may have, he may not have. There's no way to tell. They all spoke Aramaic. And the reason why they spoke Aramaic is because the Assyrians, that was the language of the Assyrians. And so when the Assyria conquered the world, everybody spoke Aramaic. When Babylon conquered the world, they didn't care if you spoke Aramaic or Babylonian. They only cared if the officials, they could talk to the officials. The regular people, they didn't care much. So these people spoke Aramaic. The common person on the street spoke, that was a Jew at that time, spoke Aramaic, and more than likely spoke Greek as well. So today in the world, most everyone is bilingual. Most everyone, except for people in America. And that's basically it. And the reason why is the second language everybody speaks is English. But if you live in Spain, if you live in Mexico and you go to school, if you live anywhere else in the world, China, anywhere else, you learn English as well as the curriculum. That's normally how the world used to work. You knew more than one language growing up. You might know even 3 or 4 languages. So, for example, like look right here, we have out on that reservation, you have Shivwits and Paiutes, right? Is it both of them are out there? They don't speak the same language. They lived naturally just across, in their habitat, they just lived real close to each other. That was common for people to have different languages. What Alexander the Great did was wanted to make everybody speak English. But yes, but in Greek. But Rome didn't care as much. Rome didn't care. They only wanted the officials to be able to speak the language. And so the officials could, and they didn't really care much if the common person spoke it or not. You get the same kind of phenomenon if you go to like India. So if you go to India, like all the signs will be in English, because India used to be ruled by Great Britain. And in Africa, some places like that. But you get there and nobody's speaking English there. No, they're not speaking English to each other. They're speaking their native tongue to each other. So Israel would be kind of like that. Yeah, everybody would probably know Greek. A few officials would know Latin. But when you show up there, people are all speaking in Aramaic. That's the language that they're normally going to be speaking in, is Aramaic.
What was the difference between a Greek and a Roman? As far as geographically, what they look like?
Well, they were Italian and Greeks were Greeks. Greeks would have been like what? They were still both be white. There'd be like difference between like an Italian today and a Greek person today. It'd be real similar.
Yeah. They're from the same geographical region.
Yeah, kind of. Rome's a little further over. They're all from Europe, though. They'd all be
Mediterranean.
Yeah, they'd all be considered from Europe. So that's like today, like nobody speaks Navajo. Even the Navajos don't speak Navajo anymore. Like a couple grandmothers, that's it, that still speak Navajo, and they're trying to fight to keep it alive. Well, Hebrew was the same way then. Most people didn't speak Hebrew. So if somebody today said something like, they were speaking American, well, that means that they were speaking English, right? Okay. A lot to get through, I know, but I think it's interesting. I think it's important stuff.
It gives us the backdrop.
Gives you the backdrop politically. Next week, like I said, next week we'll start hitting the Gospels, like why we believe them. And we'll also talk about the different groups as well, like what's the difference between a Pharisee and a Sadducee. So that shouldn't take too long. I think pretty much everybody knows that one. I'll turn